Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to do some minor upgrades to the ClodBuster. We've got the two axles nicely rebuilt now with a nice set of bearings so they're spinning super smoothly. What we're missing is the bit in the middle. And while I was proud of my B&Q special I made as a teenager, and it certainly acted as a bit of a nostalgia hit, its performance really isn't great. So here we have a V-Pro chassis kit from ClodShop over at ukmonsters.co.uk. Bought with my own hard-earned pennies of course via the eBay shop. It's a carbon race chassis with lots of adjustment and some very fancy bits. With it being a race chassis, it's going to sit pretty low to the ground and the articulation is going to be quite limited with the beefy anti-roll bars. Its climbing ability isn't going to be great, but when we get to adding some faster motors, it's going to be up there with the best handling clods. Right, we're going to start by fitting up the rear axle, which should be just a little bit easier than the front one. We'll have a look at what I had to do on the front axle with the steering a little bit later. First, we need to fit the upper link mount. Just like the chassis, it's carbon fibre and comes with a nice set of fixings and spacers. And would you just look at that? It doesn't seem like it was that long ago when carbon fibre was a crazy exotic material for RCs. Right, for each of the mounts we've got two parts so they double up. I suppose they're made of the same thickness as the chassis, so it'll save a bit on getting them cut out, which is fair enough. I can imagine thick sheet would still be quite expensive. For the fixings, we've got a long screw with two washers and a spacer, which is pretty standard stuff. The other screw is a bit funky though. We've got the two washers again, but this time there's also three larger washers with flats ground into them. That's to get around the slightly strange clearances around the mounting hole on the gearbox. It might have been nice if it was a single bit of tube, but I'm sure they'll work just fine. We'll start by taking out the top front screw and the one above the motor. Don't forget to fish out the nuts too. If they don't fall out by themselves, you can always thread a screw in from the wrong side and pull them free. With the chassis kit, you get a nice colour sheet with some instructions on, but I did find it easier in some parts just to go to ukmonsters.co.uk and use the images there. Some of them are fairly high resolution, so you can really zoom in and see the details of the assembly. For the front mount, we can see there's a nylock nut with one of the plain washers at one end, the three washers with the flats acting as spacers, and it's going to be a fair guess to assume that the other plain washer goes under the screw head to protect the carbon. For the other mounting point, it's a similar story, except instead of the washers with the flats, we've got the metal spacer. All straightforward stuff. Here we go then. We'll pop the front screw through the carbon with the washer under the head. Pop the washers with the flats over the threads and pop the screw through the hole in the gearbox. Now I initially found trying to get the washers lined up to be a bit tricky, but if you use gravity you can jiggle them all roughly into the right place so they slide right in. Then we just pop the last washer on, followed by the nut. We don't want to do them up all the way just yet though. We want the mount to freely hinge up and down with a little bit of sideways movement to make the other screw easier to fit. Again, we've got the screw with the washer under its head, and that goes through the carbon. Next we have the spacer before we pop the screw through the hole in the gearbox. Fit the last washer and the nut and nip up the screw. Spin the gearbox around and nip up the other one, and that's the upper link mount fitted. It's really solid, looks rather nice. It adds a bit of fanciness without going mad with the bling. Perfect! Next up, we've got to get the axle ready for the lower links. Now, like a lot of race chassis, they mount to the bottom half of the C-hubs. Not my favourite method. I split a good few plastic parts when I tried it on my own chassis. There's some reinforcement parts available from the States, but after shipping and duty, they are getting a little bit expensive. I'm going to try it as it is for now, and look into importing some bits if needed. Maybe we'll go mad and fit some aluminium axle tubes. Anyway, with the knuckles removed, we can have a look at the end of the C-hubs. You can see the screw head of the M3 screw that goes into the axle brace. Basically, we need to mirror that at the bottom. If we have a look at the instructions, it says a 3mm hole needs to be drilled at the bottom of each axle tube to attach the lower link mounts. Easy enough. I'm going to pop the top screw out so we can fairly accurately transfer the dimensions to the bottom. I'm going to be a little bit naughty and use the sharp corners on the vernier to very lightly mark the plastic. You can just about get away with it on plastic, but anything harder and you do run the risk of damaging the tips. We need two dimensions, the distance from the outside of the bearing and the center point. Now we've got a barely visible mark on the plastic where we need to drill, but first we're going to use a center punch to pop a proper mark that the drill's going to follow. I'm going to run a small drill bit through first, something like 1.5mm, then follow that with the 3mm. Using the small bit first just makes it easier to get the hole started in the punch mark, especially when using a hand drill. And there we go, one pair of holes. I'll refit the top screw so we're ready to fit the axle to the chassis. Right, if we look at the instruction sheet again, we can see what we need to do next. The top mount is really simple. There's just a screw and a nut that goes through the ball ends and the top mount. The bottom is a bit funky though. The screws go through the outside of the axle, through the ball end of the lower link, then to hold it all together it uses the rod end that attaches the anti-roll bar. Quite neat and should be quite easy to assemble. All the bits we need are already attached to the chassis, so we'll need to remove the rod ends and screws from the end of the links. It's a bit of a shame that the chassis isn't a proper kit of parts. It would have been nice to build, I'm sure, but at the same time having it pre-built does save a lot of hassle. The manufacturer knows all the bits are there, and there's going to be less people moaning when they screw up the assembly. To fit the links then, we pop one of the screws in from the outside of the axle, slide the ball end over the thread, then the loose rod end slides its ball onto the anti-roll bar, and we thread the screw into the plastic. At this stage we're not quite going to do the screws up tight. We will need to position the rod ends for the roll bar so the axle can swing up and down without it binding. So we will come back to it once everything else is mounted. The other side is exactly the same of course. Screw, link, roll bar, do it up so it's not quite tight. The top links are really simple. We just need to remove the nut from the screw and one of the links, pop the screw into the middle hole on the top mount, pop the link back on and nip up the nut. Really easy, and so far the chassis has been perfect to deal with. At no stage have I had to faff about forcing things into position to get holes to line up, and I've not had to get the files out. Everything has fitted perfectly. It's very high quality stuff. Flipping the chassis over again, we need to tighten the lower link screws. We need to tighten them so the rod ends are positioned so when the axle goes up and down, the balls for the roll bar can freely move without stressing the plastic. As a rough guide, they seem to work okay when they're vertical. We could rotate them a little bit if needed, but we won't know for sure until we get some dampers on, just to see how far the axle's going to travel. For now though, they do look pretty good. There's no visible binding, and it's all moving incredibly smoothly. Once we put the knuckles back on and fitted the rear lockout, that's the rear axle mounted up. A super straightforward build without any bodgery or hacking to make it work. Nice and refreshing compared to quite a few builds these days. Right, front axle next, which as you can imagine is more or less exactly the same except for the steering. My DIY front mount for the servo is going to cause a minor little problem. Before we get to that though, we need to remove the knuckles and the servo saver, and remove the servo from its mount so we can get to the screws. Now if we compare the axles we can quickly see the problem. On the rear axle we've got a long button head screw with the nylock nut that attaches the front of the top mount. On the front axle I'm already using that hole for the servo. Now we can't use the screw and nut that comes with the mount as there's no space for the nut for one and the screw wouldn't be long enough. What we need is a countersunk screw that is long enough to go through the servo plate and its spacers, through the gearbox, through the washers and the top mount and still have enough thread for the nut. And well, after much searching through parts drawers to no avail, I eventually found this one in a random junk box. It feels like it's plated brass, so not ideal. I should really source a nice steel one, but it will get us going. We can remove the screw and the nut that's in place at the moment, keeping a bit of pressure on the plate so the plastic spacer doesn't drop out. Feed the long screw in from the servo plate side. Now we can slide on the washers that come with the mount kit, followed by the link mount itself, a washer and an M3 nut. Now it doesn't quite look as nice as the rear axle with the shiny screw head on show, but functionally it'll be just fine. The other screw for the top mount is exactly the same as the rear. Actually fitting the axle is the same as the rear from here on. The only oddball bit being that there's already holes drilled in the ends of the axles from when I was experimenting with other chassis builds years ago, so that's going to save a bit of time. With the axle on the chassis, we can fit the new steering servo. The old high-tech is still going strong, but it's got plastic gears and it's a bit on the slow side. I've got the now fairly typical 25 kilogram metal gear servo to replace it. Usually these cheap servos are pretty good. The quality control isn't brilliant though, so you do sometimes get a lemon. I think for me it's around 1 in 8 that fail soon after using them off-road. Not great, but you do get a lot of servo for your 10 or 15 quid. The servo comes with a metal arm, which on a crawler I'd use quite happily, but on a truck like this I'd like to have a bit of protection, so I've got a heavy duty Kimbro servo saver. It just means when there's a lot of force on the steering, like a front heavy landing on one corner, there's a bit of spring in the steering just to take out some shock. Hopefully it'll be just enough that we won't have to worry about stripping gears in the servo. The servo saver comes with a self-tapping screw, but since we've got a metal gear servo, we need to swap it out for an M3 one. Again, I've readied the junk box and found a nice M3x8 from Tamiya that will do the trick. To fit the servo saver, we need to use one of the spline adapters. Now, these cheap servos use the same splines as a Futaba servo, so we're going to use the one with an F next to it. The adapter goes on the servo, then we pop the servo saver on and fit the screw. Now we can refit the knuckles, and that's the front axle more or less complete. We still need to hook up the steering linkage to the servo, but given I'm using my old DIY bits, I'm going to sort that out off camera, as it's probably going to involve some bodges that shouldn't really be made public. Besides, if you're building up a Clod using this chassis, you can get a steering kit with a very nice carbon plate and the linkages as a pack, which should go together just as nicely as the chassis. A much better proposition. Okay, we're nearly at the rolling chassis stage now. We just need some dampers. Now this chassis will take quite a range of lengths in various positions, so not wanting to splash out on a set until I got some idea what's going to work, I've dug through the junk box again and found an old set of I think 85mm Carson dampers. Now one was completely dry inside and the other 3 were only half full of oil, so I suspect they're in the junk box because they leak. But I've cleaned them up and refilled them, so we can at least use them to get a feel for what we need to buy. Now these dampers use bushings or spacers on the top rather than a ball, so we need some plastic bits to fit them. Turns out the plastic parts from the old Traxxas dampers are a perfect fit, so we'll use a set of them. The bottom end of the damper mounts directly to the lower suspension link. There's a screw in the second hole that we need to remove and use. Since we're just getting a feel for it, the second hole seems like a good a place to start as any. We can always adjust it later. For the top, the chassis comes with a metal spacer that looks like it will work well with a ball-ended damper, but for these Carson ones, it's just a little bit wide. I'm going to replace it with a 3mm nylon spacer, and when combined with the Traxxas part, the dampers sit pretty close to vertical. Just like everything else on this chassis, there's loads of mounting holes for the top of the damper. We're just going to use the holes so the lower link is just slightly pointing downwards of level. Again, for no other reason than it seems like a good place to start. Now we just rinse and repeat, so we've got a fully sprung chassis. Very nice. Okay, last bit for today, we're going to pop the wheels on. They just offer up to the hubs and we thread on M4 nuts. And after a bit of manhandling, we have a rolling chassis. Look at that, it's a beautiful beast. There's still lots to do though, but so far the suspension feels very plush. It has that stiff but supple race type feel to it, most impressive. However, there is a problem. It says on the website and the manual, you will need wider than stock wheels or wheel wideners. Now because the lower links are so wide, there's almost no clearance between the tyres and the links. If we spin the chassis round and turn the wheels a bit, you can see the issue. It's fairly common with aftermarket chassis, and even if you just fiddle with the steering a bit with the stock chassis, you can run into the same issue. So with a Clod, it's fairly common once you start modifying to make it wider. Next week then, we're going to tackle that with some custom wheel wideners, which should be fun. For now though, that's about it. So far, I'm really very happy with the chassis. It's not that cheap, but the quality of the parts more than makes up for it. All the tolerances and fits are spot on. Until next week then, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!